Well, good evening and welcome to the Wheeler Centre tonight. I'm Ramona Koval, and here I sit with the distinguished writer David Malouf, who is always courteous and measured and modest. So I know I'm at risk of embarrassing him by telling you that I'm kind of a bit, I don't want to be gushing, but I've spoken to David quite a few times over the years in a professional setting like this, and I'm always really excited to do so because I look forward to hearing the way his interesting mind works and the words he chooses to use, the language he chooses to express his ideas. And it's even more of an event than usual because in 3 days, and I know it's hard to believe, and maybe a bit unfair as he looks so good, but in 3 days David Malouf will turn 80, and I've written here, audience gasps and claps. And it's not that he should just get a prize for turning up day after day for 80 years, but it's that he continues to nourish us with his work. Novels, short stories, poetry, memoir, libretti, essays. He turns his hand and his heart and his mind to all of them. And I won't list all the titles and I won't list all the prizes because we're all here because we're tremendous fans and we know. So, as well as Words of Wisdom on turning 80, there are 2 new books. One's called Earth Hour, book of poetry, and a collection of his essays and lectures and other prose pieces called A First Place. And you'll be able to buy them up the back and get them signed at the end of our conversation. But, David, could we start? I wanted to start our conversation with poetry. And would you mind reading a poem from this new collection? I'm going to give you this one. And this one.
The poem is called Entreaty. After the age of innocence, golden brawlers in the arms of demigods, we arrive at the age of reason, credulous, poor monsters led by a dream team in a mad dance down loud streets into quicksand. After that, it's the age of the 7 pills daily. Small mercies restore us, bayside air, salt sweet in our mouths again. We set out for the corner shop, and by some happy chance it is still there. The same old woman keeps it. When the doorbell shakes her from sleep, through wisps of grey smoke from her asthma papers, what's it to be this? What's your poison this time, love? She wheezes. Is it a riddle? If it is, I'm lost. The ancient grins abides the answer. I clench my fist on the hot penny I've brought. Only now, a lifetime later, find my tongue. If luck is with me today on my long walk home, may no black cat cross my path, no sweet-talking stranger, no thief, no mischief maker, no trafficker in last words waylay me.
Isn't that wonderful? I think we were once speaking about another collection of poems of yours, Typewriter Music, and you said one of the great things about when you get very old is that you can look back on your youth and its follies with a certain kind of affectionate irony. And I think that's sort of partly what the poem does, revolving days, while wanting to say that nothing we ever feel entirely gets lost. Is that how you feel, that nothing is lost, no age is lost?
Well, yes. I mean, it depends. A memory is a very strange thing, and it's something that abides with us. And in our memory, we can go back to situations that we experienced one way and experience them in another from a different point of view. It's still the same person who's doing it, but one of the things is that we're bringing to that occasion the 40 or 50 or 60 years that has passed since. It's a bit like rereading a book and discovering that you're a different person in the reading of the book, although the book is the same.
So is it sort of like looking back on a dream when you look back on your life?
No, it's a bit like stepping back into a moment in your body's history, really, when it was a kind of different body, but it's the same experiencing entity, whether we call it a mind or whatever. And that's a very interesting thing. I mean, it tells us something about what continuity is and what change is and what it is in us that doesn't change, although it may grow, all of that.
Has poetry, I mean, I know poetry's been with you since you were a child. The impulse to write, is it always there for you?
Yeah, because the impulse to write, in my case, is very difficult to know how other people work entirely. And I suspect that for an awful lot of writers, what writing springs from really is a kind of puzzlement that you have never grown out of. I think there's something childlike that remains in the writer, and it's got to do with the fact that life always presents itself to you as curious rather than familiar, and that there are always questions. And what you tend to ask yourself as a writer is, why am I back considering this again? And why is this the thing out there that's somehow grabbed me and I can't get hold of it? And writing is an attempt really to answer that question and to get hold of it.
Sort of get hold of it and let it go at the same time? Because if you're going back to your... I mean, you said something about, I think in that... I'm not sure, now I've read so much in the last few weeks about where you said this, about knowing what your body of work is, knowing what is, a David Malouf book or a David Malouf poem,
yeah. That
you might write another book, and you probably have tried to write other books but realise that that's not my book.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to get hold of things again and again, but you're also, do you try and let go as well? Do you think you've done that?
You don't let go of them. What happens is you come up with a provisional answer for this time, and the puzzlement remains. And I think it's that capacity to remain always puzzled and always in doubt that is a characteristic of writing and keeps it open.
I'm interested in poetry and your introduction to it because you've written about the school readers in the Queensland education system. You seem to be grateful and admiring of the education you had in those early years with the school readers and how they prepared you for literature, for appreciating a poem. And you write about the work of D.H. Lawrence and the poem The Snake. Tell us about The Snake and why that was so important for you.
Look, that was a poem I encountered in my very first year at secondary school. I would have been 12, a little bit, late in my 12th year. And up until that time, I'd read huge amounts of poetry because the Queensland reading books were meant to really introduce you, by the time you left primary school, to pretty well the whole of English poetry. So we'd by then read the whole of The Ancient Mariner and the whole of Milton's L'Allegro and loads of stuff. I mean, Wordsworth's poems, lots of them. And most of those we also learned off by heart. And that was what you did with poetry in those days. I know that's now regarded as a form of child abuse. Making children learn a poem is regarded as the most terrible thing to do to them because it's utterly, destroys their imagination or something. But I've always been quite certain that the only way ever to get to the centre of a poem is really to learn it off by heart. And that's what I've always done. Any poem that I've come across that really strikes me and that I want to keep with me and fully understand, I'll begin by learning it off by heart.
Because you've said the experience learning makes you sort of, it makes it yours. It's almost as if you get inside it and see what it's like, where it reaches to, in a way.
Yeah, look, what it puts absolutely inside your head and inside your body is the music of the poem. And what I think we don't ever appreciate enough is the extent to which the poem is its music and the meaning is in the music. So if at 10 years old you learn Milton's Wordsworth's Daffodils off by heart, of course you don't understand what it means. But if you come back to it at 20 and you did learn it and it is in your head as a piece of music, suddenly things that would be difficult for you to grasp for the first time in the poem are already available to you. They're there. And that old-fashioned way of dealing with poetry seems to me to be still absolutely essential. So what happened in that third form at grammar in 1947 or whatever it was, 47, was that in an anthology we were then given, and I would have taken that home and immediately read through the whole thing. And then I found this poem by Lawrence, which was actually the first non-formal poem I had ever come across, certainly the first modernist poem I'd ever come across. And the first poem that... What the poem does is it begins with an actual situation, and then it sort of works itself way in puzzlement through the mind of the poet until he has a kind of revelation at the end of it. And the revelation is that the voices of your education lead you astray. That's a good thought to put into the mind of a 13-year-old kid. And that something else is there. And then it ends up with a kind of, I think, an absolutely haunting image, which has never really left me, and which was reinforced because, again, in my old school reading books, we did a lot of Greek mythology. And so I knew absolutely what the story of Pluto and Persephone was, and even had an image in my mind because there was a very brilliantly painted illustration in the reading book of Lord Leighton's Return of Persephone. And so that's where the Lawrence poem ends. So I had been absolutely prepared to receive this poem at the moment when it tumbled into my hands.
And I'm so glad that you wrote about it, because it tumbled into my hands just this week for the first time.
This poem?
Yeah, I've never read it before.
It's extraordinary.
No, it's not. I mean, I'm not a very well-educated person.
No, I mean, the poem is extraordinary.
Oh, it is extraordinary. I love this poem. If you don't know it, like me, I didn't know it. It's fantastic, this poem, The Snake by D.H. Lawrence. So, but, you know, the whole idea of it being educated, though, I think we once had a conversation in Edinburgh, I think, with Michael Ondaatje, do you remember?
Yeah.
About, you know, lost classics and lost poetry. And you said, I taught at a university for a long time, and the only kind of poems that ever get taught at university are poems that there is a lot to say about. What that means is what we would have once have been thought of as the great glory of English poetry, which is the lyric, is virtually not taught at all and virtually not read. It's an appalling state of affairs, you said. Do you still think so?
Yeah, I think there's a tendency, you know, in the academic world to believe that poems which are dense in some kind of way and have a lot of tension or whatever in the meaning are the poems that you need to get students to grapple with. Whereas, you know, a lot of poems which are transparent and are mostly musical, there's not much you can do with them except read them, learn them off by heart. But, you know, there's not much discussion possible. So they tend to not be the poems that turn up in a seminar or something like that. I learned that when I was teaching in England, and we used to do the kids twice a week, once on Wednesday afternoon and once on Saturday mornings. Used to be given an exercise from something called Reading and Discrimination. And there were always two poems or two pieces of prose on opposite pages. And the poems were often a lyric, of a kind that Shelley might have written on one side, and a kind of metaphysical poem on the other. And the kids were supposed to tell you which was the better poem. And, of course, it was perfectly obvious. One was a poem which was full of musical, transparent statements about which you could say nothing. And the other one was one that, presented you with real problems of reading. And, they made their choice, but it's not my choice any longer.
Mm. And I think you also think sometimes that the best thing to do with a book or with a poem is to say to someone, I love this poem, here it is, read it, and see what you think.
But I think that's what happens with books too. I think, we all know that what kind of gets books out there is just word of mouth. And the best thing you can do with a book really is, that you've really been impressed by, is to say to somebody, look, go away and read this. I mean, partly you're doing it because you want them to read the book, but saying that too is a way of saying, and learn something else about me. And I think that's kind of where books and people interconnect.
So do you think you could ever love someone who didn't love the books you loved?
Oh, of course. we love people who mostly who are, like the rest of the world, utterly puzzling to us because they present us with what's different, what's opposite to us.
But you want someone to learn about you by appreciating this book. Well, they will do so, yeah. And I mean, there's something of that in it. I'm only meaning to point out that, you choose who to give the book to, as well as choose the book. And that really is an appeal to something between you, which has got to do with understanding. But see, I wouldn't have come across that poem and if I hadn't read your review of the Book of Lawrence's poetry, I think it was. Or,
yeah.
And the way you talked about it and the way you analysed it made me think, I've got to get this poem. And then I read it and I thought it was fantastic. But I needed you to show me.
Yeah, well, that's not shameful.
Well, I'm not ashamed of it either.
But that's the way...
I just want you to come and show me how to read poems all the time.
I mean, that's... when I went to university, of course you go to lectures and you hear people telling you things, but I would say that most of what I learned at university in the old days, when there were lectures but there were no tutorials at all, was from other students. And, you sat around the refectory or a pub or the public library or wherever it was, and you listened to what they had to tell you, and you exchanged ideas. And very often, what you relied on them for was the books you needed to discover. And that's how I discovered certainly E.M. Forster in that year or Auden. None of those people were on the course we were doing, or Rilke. They were the people I needed to discover at that moment, or the character who is the prototype of Jono in the book, whom I'd been at school with, and who was actually a geology student. Just came up to me one day in the public library and put a book down in front of me and said, "You ought to read this," and that was Nietzsche. Very, very important. But that's Nietzsche. That's how you. Once, I don't know what happens now, but that's once how you got an education, only partly in lecture rooms, often from other students.
But that's what Facebook and tweeting is about too.
Good.
It is. It says, "This is good. I read it. You might like it." That's about a lot of people use it like that. Why don't you read us that second poem before we start talking about the essays?
You better tell me what page it's on.
There's one on page 4 and one on page 10. So I think we did the page 10 first already. What about the 4?
I know 4. Yeah. Okay. This is actually about the person we've just been talking about. It's called Retrospect. A day at the end of winter, 2 young men, hooded against the silvery, thin rain that lights the forest boughs, are making towards a town that at this distance never gets closer. one of them, not me, as he turns, impatient for the other to catch up, wears even now when I meet his face in dreams, the look of one already gone too far into the forest. As when, last night, in sleep, I looked behind me out of the queue for an old movie, and you were there, hood thrown back, your stack of dirty blonde hair misted with sky rack. And when my heart leapt to meet you, no, your glance, in the old conspiratorial way, insisted, don't speak, don't recognise me. So I did not turn again, but followed down the track to where, all those years back, you turned and waited, and we went on together at the bare end of winter, breath from our mouths still clouding the damp air, our footsteps loud on the rain-lit cobbled street down into Sèvres.
Fantastic. I wanted now to talk about the collection of prose writing, A First Place, which is the other book that's come out on this auspicious time. And I suppose this is part of what we were talking about before, about bringing everybody with you, or everybody who used to be with you. But you say no man or woman really migrates. They bring their first life with them. And you write about your parents and how they brought their first places with them in a way. What did they bring with them from their first lives?
Well, I was really talking about my mother because my father was born in Brisbane. But my mother had left England when she was 11. The family then had, up until that point, had been very well off and lived in a very grand house with servants, a cook and nursemaid and hot and cold running chambermaids. And they'd been people who went out to balls because the pictures I have of my grandparents are in very, very grand late Victorian costumes, all dressed out to go out to a ball. And they went to first nights because my mother's eldest sister remembers going to the first night of the Belle of New York and such things. And then they lost all their money in a bank crash in 1912 and came to Australia third class on a boat. My mother, as I say, was 11 and her next oldest sister was 17. And the other children were grown up. 3 or 4 of them stayed in England. And for my mother, that meant that whatever life she thought she was headed for when she was 10 was just completely different. It was taken away from her. It never happened. And they went and lived in tents at Mount Morgan in Queensland, where one of the sons was gold mining, and then eventually went to Brisbane. And my mother had a very good life in Australia and a very rich one, you know, in terms of interesting life. But it was not the life that she thought she was going to have. And that old ghost life continued, and it was largely that she was offering my sister and me by recreating her Edwardian childhood as far as she could do in Brisbane in the 30s.
And this was translated via books that she had around her?
Oh, she reread over and over again the books that she'd grown up reading, and we had a girl who lived in the house and who did that cooking and looked after us children, and she and Cassie, as she was called, would read aloud to one another every afternoon with me somewhere overhearing it. And the books that she tended to read were the books that she would have read earlier. All the Mrs. Henry Wood novels, which I must be the only child in Australia who, you know, at the age of 12 had read myself every book of Mrs. Henry Wood, the Channings and Roland York and Mrs. Dangerous Troubles and Lord Oakburn's Daughters, the whole lot of them. And The Lamplighter and The Woman Thou Gavest Me, all those books.
Oh, and was this sort of a little bit of England too in your home?
Oh, yeah, and my mother had very strong opinions about how you should speak. And we were never allowed, for example, to say Bob.
Bob?
Yeah, you're supposed to say shilling.
I thought you were supposed to say Robert.
No. No, we weren't allowed to use any kind of slang whatsoever, and all that.
And the food?
Oh, the food was proper English food, yeah. It was proper food. It was stew or shepherd's pie, and followed by a proper boiled pudding and all of that.
And your dad was Lebanese, from a Lebanese family?
Yeah. No, he loved all of that.
Did he?
Oh, yeah. He was in love with England. He was in love with my mother.
Well, you've said in that essay, I think, I've always been impressed by the degree to which accident may be fate.
Yeah.
That, thinking about if she only hadn't met him at that time, if they only hadn't had the crash, if they only hadn't to come to this place, I wouldn't be here.
Well, that's the story of every Australian, really. I think, we're all the product of people coming from places other than places where they would have ever met one another. In that same essay, I quote one of my favourite poems, which is a little poem of Thomas Hardy, called Mellstock Church. And he goes back to the moment when his mother is sitting in the pew in the church, and she looks up into the organ gallery where the father is playing in the little Sunday orchestra, and their glances cross for the first time, and he realises and says that this is the moment when the possibility of me came into being. And I think a lot of children kind of think of that as being an extraordinary moment, but it's always an accidental one, but in a place, as that one was too. But that was two people in a little village in Dorset, not as strange as two people who've come from different sides of the world, and because their families both migrate to Australia, end up being your mother and father.
I'm just going to diverge a bit, because you spoke recently to Susan Wyndham. I thought it was a great piece of description of you and a conversation in the Sydney Morning Herald. And you told her about a chance meeting you had when you were 25, when you did a kind thing for a stranger, and which directed you to somewhere you may not have found. Would you just tell that story?
Oh, look, I went to... I had gone to England, and was teaching in London, finished teaching, and decided I would go away for the long vacation. And I decided that I was going to Spain and Portugal. So I bought a guide to Spain and Portugal and did a whole lot of research about which places I wanted to go to, and went to the great trouble of getting a visa to both those places. And I had to catch the train in Paris to Spain, but I didn't have a ticket. I didn't ever buy tickets in those days or book things. I just went along. And I thought I'd spend the day in Paris and I'd go and find Johnny Milliner, who's the Jono of the novel. And as usual, he'd done his usual thing. He was the most elusive person. And he'd given me an address to write to him, and I had been writing. But when I went there, they didn't know who he was. It was just this guy who came and picked up the letter, so I had no way of finding him. So I went back to the station and decided I'd wait until the evening train, which was the train to Madrid, but I still didn't buy a ticket. And then this utterly ragged boy, about 19, came up to me and said, "Do you speak French?" And I said, "Yes." He said in English, and he told me a story. He'd been robbed, and he'd been working in France, and all his money was taken away from him, and he wanted to know where he could find a refuge in Paris where he could sleep for the night. So I went to Mademoiselle de Paris, who's that woman in a beautiful uniform who sits at the station offering to find you five-star hotels. And said to her, "Look, this guy needs a refuge." So she looked it up, and she
had
him...
refuges as well as five-star hotels.
She looked up the phone book or something and found the Salvation Army and a couple of other things. So we did that, and he had the address. So I bought him a metro ticket, and to get there, and gave him 1,000 francs, which was in those days just 1 franc. This before they changed. And that was my amount of money I was to spend each day. And he burst into tears and said, look, I'll never be able to thank you, but if you were to go to Germany, you would be thanked over and over again. And so I shook hands and off he went. And I went up, and when I looked up on the board, there was a train to Koblenz that was going in 10 minutes or something. So I decided, well, maybe I should be going to Germany. So I bought a ticket to Koblenz, and really that was an absolute revelation to me. I mean, I had been going the wrong way. I didn't go to Spain for another 20 years. And, but, you know, I ended up that summer walking around Bavaria and going into every Baroque and every Rococo church, and that was a huge discovery for me. So it was like having met an angel at the crossroads who says, go back, you're going the wrong way.
But it was a test, though, wasn't it? If it was an angel or one of those Roman gods or Greek gods that you're so fond of, they do like to play tricks, don't they?
Yeah, well, it could have been a trick, but he was absolutely right.
I mean, if you hadn't been kind, then you would never have got to go to, probably not go to Germany at that time.
Yeah,
so that was a test for you.
I don't think it is so much as a reward for kindness as something simply, you know, there you are, and we're always there at some kind of crossroads, and you meet somebody who says, I know there's a fork in the road, but that's the one you should take.
So do you believe in fate?
Accident. I mean, randomness, but accidents that, if they turn out right for us, turn out to be fate.
And if they turn out wrong for us, what do we call them then?
Then you say they're missteps. And
but as we said before, all the steps that lead to here must have been the right steps.
Yeah, all the steps that lead to here are the right steps. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, so we've got this image of you as the young writer, and you're out there in the world, and you're taking forks in the road, and you're learning about the great movements and the great writers and the great poetry. But let's talk about now what it is to be Australian and what it is to be an Australian writer. And you've said that Australian writers have had a harder time than some others in grasping what is authentic in their experience. What do you mean?
Look, partly it is that really what I want to say is that the only duty a writer has is to what most deeply and personally interests them, and what creates in them the kind of energy that you need as a writer. And that's not got, that's the agency in you that knows most about that is your writing self, which is not necessarily the rest of yourself. And, you know, I think of something like what both Kipling or Lawrence say, that, you know, there's a demon. And Lawrence puts it wonderfully, and he says, if you put your hand over the demon's mouth and speak, then what you're doing will be no good. What you've got to do is shut up and listen to the demon and write what he is telling you to write. And that's really like saying,
like,
that's really saying that there's some other agency in you that the writing comes from, and partly learning to be a writer is learning to listen. And what Kipling says there is, don't think, drift, listen and obey. And I think it's quite hard as a young writer to work that out.
But why, and what's so hard about being an Australian young writer?
Well, because I think if you're an Australian young writer, you think somehow that what you have to write has to be about Australia, has to speak for Australia, to the tribe. And it's some of what you do will do that and still be utterly, utterly personal to you. But there are things that really don't involve that at all. I mean, in my case, that would be a book like An Imaginary Life, or a book like Ransom, or a book like Child's Play. I mean, they are Australian because I can't put word to paper without revealing the fact that it's an Australian doing it. And, you know, the people like the French, when that book went into, when Imaginary Life went back into French, the first thing they said was, you know, this is a writer writing about this material in a way in which no European would ever write it. So that's the Australianness, and you can't escape that. But, you know, we get hung up with the idea that the books we write have to be a contribution to Australian literature. And all I would say about that is that my line of great Australian novels, the ones that I am fondest of, are mostly books that are not set in Australia and had nothing to do with Australia. Morris Guest, for example, or Her Private Swe, or The Middle Parts of Fortune of Frederick Manning, Letty Fox, Her Luck, Cotter's England. They're the great Australian novels, great novels by Australians, but they would never get a Miles Franklin.
Yeah, but you know, going back to Ovid for a second. I mean, do you think that The Imaginary Life? Do you think that the Australianness about that was that you understood about exile?
I think there were various things in that. I mean, partly that was about, and I wouldn't have recognised any of that when I was writing the book. But the argument there between the edge and the centre, for example, is, as people later pointed out, a post-colonial problem.
You were very prescient.
Pardon?
You were prescient.
I will, that's one way of putting it. But no, look, I was writing about something that I saw in that material which was essential to me. And, you know, the problem there too of being what happens to you as a poet was what I was really writing about. If you find yourself in a place where no one speaks your language, and the questions that raised about language, they're also post-colonial problems, as it turns out. But I mean, for me, they were personal things, and I think that's what you have to write. But you know, when I wrote that book, I didn't know whether it was a novel, because it could be a monologue, it could be a long prose poem or something. I didn't say to myself, this is a novel. It was just a piece of writing. But I knew that it would not be published in Australia because, as far as I know at that moment, nobody in Australia would ever have published a piece of writing that was not about Australia. And, you know, it was only later that people recognised it as even having something to say to the tribe here.
You say two interesting things about the same thing in this book. I mean, these essays are collected over quite a long period of time.
30 years.
And early in the essays, you say geography is fate.
Yeah.
But I noticed later on you saying that, that the new communication means that mere geography will never again determine our sense of where we stand. Now, I wonder whether that's a change of view or a nuancing of view.
Well, in some way, geography is fate because if you're a writer, what shapes your sensibility is the first sensory experience you have in the world. And if that's going to shape you, then you need to look at where that is. You know, for me, that was Brisbane. So a particular kind of light, a particular kind of dampness in the air, a particular phenomenon like the fact that, you know, every afternoon at 4 o'clock in the summer, there's a crack of lightning and then the heavens open up and everything thunders on the roof. And then after that, there is this extraordinary light in which everything seems to be lit from inside, so that everything that's green is sort of lit up from inside and luminous. That and the topography of the place and the kind of domestic architecture you grow up in, they're your first sensory experiences. So, of course, that is what shapes you. So geography will always be fate in that way, because it's going to be the thing that you can't escape in the making of your way, the way you see the world. But in that sense in which we once thought of ourselves as being distant from some centre, you know, the world has changed in that way, because communication has meant that everything is instant wherever you are. And that's a different kind of change in geography. The other one won't change.
You've written before and talked about the Queenslander, the architecture of the house, where the meaning of inside and outside and upstairs and downstairs is completely different to perhaps if you were growing up in Tasmania.
Yeah, or even New South Wales. I live now in a terraced house, which is a very different experience from living in a Queenslander, which is surrounded by verandas and where the verandas are light but the house is dark. All of that's... And under the house, which is, another place which doesn't exist anywhere else. When Americans refer to that, it's called a crawl space, and it's obviously a very small space, but in Queensland it can be 19 feet high in the front and 2 feet high at the back, because the land slopes so completely, and that's a very, very strange world, and it is a very, very important world in the play life and in the dream life of children who grow up in it.
Because it's secret underneath
because
it? You can be private?
It's secret, because when you go down there, nobody goes there, and it's cobwebby, and it's got this strange distortion of distance, because the high stumps at the front and the small stumps at the back make it look like something that is really only 10 metres long, looks like 300 metres. That's a strange, teaches you something odd and disorienting about how to measure distance and space, and also because down there I stored all the things that were once in the house and are no longer wanted. And then in the floor, a lot of things have fallen through the floorboards down there that people have forgotten they ever had and have lost and don't know where they went. So that's a very strange space.
And upstairs, you could overhear things, although you weren't supposed to.
Well, it was a wooden house. I mean, wooden houses are different from stone houses. And for some reason, because Queenslanders are obsessed with breeze, their idea of a pleasant atmosphere is all the windows to be open and an absolute tornado kind of blowing through the house. No doors are ever closed. And there's a kind of social sense that if you've closed a door, something must be going on behind it that shouldn't be happening. So even bathroom and lavatory doors get left open. And so you grow up in such a house knowing that there are things that you shouldn't hear, and so you don't hear them. Unless you're a little writer, and I think all little writers are from the beginning very, very curious, and they quickly learn that eavesdropping is one of the best ways of finding out about almost everything. So one of the ways in which they apprentice themselves from 3 or 4 years old to being writers is that they become very expert little eavesdroppers.
You must have been very still as a child too, like not to be noticed.
People don't always notice children. The trouble is, the only thing I used to have as a trouble was my mother in those days didn't go out to work, so she had ladies for morning tea and afternoon tea and bridge and so on, and I liked to have around, and frequently when somebody was going to tell somebody something that was very, very secret, my mother would say to me something like, just go downstairs to the washing tubs and find the scrubbing brush. And I would work out pretty quickly that she should have no need in the next 5 minutes for a scrubbing brush. So, I'd say, you really want this scrubbing brush, or are you just trying to get rid of me? And I would go very slowly and, and linger a bit, because that's the other thing about little boy children, is that until they're about 5, they're largely allowed absolute access to a woman's world. And after that, you get excluded. And you're supposed to sort of then be in a men's world. But I think, again, writers who know that it's going to be too important to them to miss love hovering around that world and watching and listening, and so I did a lot of hovering and listening.
But you were such a late bloomer, though, as a writer. I mean, in terms of publications. Your first book of poems when you were 36, is that right?
No. Yeah, well, full book. Yeah, but I published poems in 4 Poets in 1962. I think I was 28. No, look...
And first novel when you were 41?
Yeah. I'd always thought I would write prose, but it took me 10 years to get that novel to a point where I thought it might be publishable. And I found I'd written poems that I thought were publishable long before I wrote any piece of prose that I thought was publishable. I've always been really committed to the idea that writing is one thing and publishing is another. And, I think at this stage, even more you have to think, does this really need to be published? But that doesn't mean that you don't want to sit down and wrestle with it as a piece of writing.
I've just looked at the clock. Can you believe it's already 7:05? And we're going to have to finish probably about 20 past. But I know that there are people in the audience who want to ask you questions. And I know there are people with microphones who will facilitate that. If you put your hand up, you'll be able to do that. So why don't you? And I can see we can all see where you are. Don't be shy. See, he's really nice. Yes, you're going to have that near your mouth to answer that eventually. Yes.
David, my name's Susan. I'm a first-generation Aussie, and I'm an Aussie. I really feel I'm an Aussie, but my parents came from elsewhere. You're an Aussie writer, but you're first generation. What makes you feel that you're an Australian?
Well, I think Australians have a particular notion about how society is that's really quite different from the way Europeans think. I mean, I've lived in Italy for 24 years, I think. I mean, not all the year, for part of the year, so that's a place I know very well. And I greatly admire the kind of world that Italians have created. It seems to me to be an utterly human world which is in touch with nature in a way that's extraordinary for a place that is so sophisticated and so developed. But I don't know, it's not true of Italy, and it's not true of any other European country that I know or have. I don't think they have in any way solved questions of how you create an orderly society, a society in which people feel responsible towards one another, where people actually care about one another, where power clearly is able to pass without violence from one administration to another. That is extraordinarily rare. And I think the fact that we have that is partly that we got part of it given to us and we've preserved it and made it work better than in the places it came from. But I think that's an extraordinary thing. And, just going to something like a big shopping centre like Broadway, as I do 2 or 3 times a day, and seeing that in that place there are people from almost any ethnic group you can think of. I mean, virtually everybody, all the kids behind the checkout counters, kids from India or some Arabian country, or the Philippines or China or something. I have never, for example, in that place, ever seen any kind of confrontation of a violent kind between any of those people. People just seem to accept that all of that works, and it does. And I think that's pretty extraordinary. And so, that's what I would say is one of the things that I take for granted in our Australianness. I like the fact that we mostly have a very loose, very, very loose notion of nation. When we need it, it's there to be taken up, but for most of the time, we simply ignore it. We don't really fly the flag very much. If you go to America, the flag is everywhere. We hardly ever fly the flag. Even on Australia Day, I've driven out into the country, and from all the way from central Sydney to up in western New South Wales, I've not seen a single flag flying. And I like that. I like the fact that when kids are, even little kids, and even 12-year-olds who are obviously from some ethnic group, are getting off a bus in Sydney, they thank the bus driver. You don't see that in other places.
Yes, another question.
Hey, I had a Queensland upbringing and education in the 1970s, including the Queensland school readers. And I know that at the time I could talk to my grandmother, who would be about 87 or 88 if she was still here, and we knew the same poems from those Queensland school readers and the same stories. Do you remember Race with the Wolves? Ginevra's Box?
Yeah.
The Well of St. Keynes?
Yeah.
Which I had to write out for forgetting my sports uniform, by the way. I never forgave it for that. But I know that as I got into my teens and the Bjelke-Petersen government looked like it was going to be there for an eternity, which was why I went to university in Canberra, but leaving that aside, I blamed the Queensland school reader for Queensland politics being in such a stagnated form, the fact that we were still reading those same readers year after year after year. And so I still have a kind of a gut reaction to the mention of them, and I'm planning to read your essay about them because it hadn't occurred to me that one could be educated with those readers and have them kind of open the world rather than feel that the world was being shut out. Is that just different times, do you think, or just the fact that I knew my grandmother had the exact same readers?
Well, I'm surprised at that, because the Queensland readers were instituted in, I think, 1908 in 6 volumes. And then in 1927, there was a 7th volume added. And what people need to remember is that Queensland had a very, very left-wing Labor government, properly socialist almost, from about 1921, I think it is, until 1957, except that the Labor Party itself had become rather complacent and moving. Yeah. But when you look at that 1927 volume, that is absolutely full of very, very liberal, in the small L liberal, and socialist thinking about war, about labour, all sorts of things. It's an entirely different ethos from those other 6 volumes. So I learned a lot of, I think, very liberal political thinking from that. There are other things in the earlier volumes which I also remember, and I kind of will never forget. They had a certain kind of really, really hard morality. of a kind that I think of as being very Queensland. And there's a wonderful story in there about a little boy called George, and his father is going away, and George says, I'm going to be away, and I'm giving you this piece of wood and these nails. I will be away for 6 days, and a little hammer. And if on any day when you are bad and your mother says you have been bad, you are to drive a nail with a hammer into the piece of wood. And any day when you are good, you take that nail out. And so George behaves badly for the first 3 days and is driven in the nails, and he gets pretty panicky, so he behaves very, very well for the next 3 days. And when he comes back, he's very proud that he can go to his father with the 6 nails in one hand and the piece of wood in the other. And he's waiting for his father's reaction, and his father says, George, George, what about those holes? Be bad, and the signs of it never go away. That's a pretty hard lesson for a 7-year-old. So yes, I mean, there are a lot of very, very strange and old-fashioned things there. But I assure you, if you went and looked at that 7th grade book, it's amazing. It also has very, very good little pieces that would have at the time surprised you. I mean, surprised me. There was a story of Madame Curie. There was a story of Palissy the potter. There was a story about Beethoven. And there was a story about Jenner and immunisation. And they were really stories that were telling you that these were possible things you might do with your life. You might try to be a scientist. You might want to be an artist, a potter or a composer. You might actually be a woman and also want to be a scientist, and all of that was possible. So there were lots of other lessons to be taken.
I think you'll be going back to that, Rita, won't you? What about another question?
Hello, David. Robert is my name. I just have a question about character development and specifically female characters, and wonder if you've ever had any problems finding a female voice, or if you have any advice on being able to do so.
I don't think I've ever ever directly written something in a first person in a female voice, but I think there are a lot of women characters there of different ages that once tried to inhabit in some way so that you get some sense of their world. I'm thinking of the mother of the 3 children, really, in Remembering Babylon, for example, who's sort of it's an attempt to understand what might have been going on in the head of a clearly intelligent and a lively woman who finds herself in a quite desperate conditions that women would have been in. She's a Scotswoman who's been part of that migration to Australia under the Lang scheme in the 1850s or something. Or a woman in a story called That Antique Jezebel, who's an Australian woman who's been overseas and has come back and has learned a certain kind of sophistication and wants to maintain it, but is very, very poor. And so she's done what a lot of European women do, which is she has just one, piece of expensive clothing, and when that is not available because it has to be dry cleaned or whatever to go out, she simply doesn't go out. And I mean, I think there are a whole lot of women's worlds there that one can write about without doing what is often difficult to do these days, which is to write from inside the person in a first person. I mean, I found the same problem when I was writing Remembering Babylon, that I wanted to be able to write about somebody who had been formed by life among Aborigines, but I didn't want to really to write, and I couldn't have written from inside an Aboriginal person's mind so that one could say I. Does that answer your question?
It sort of does. I just wondered whether you had questioned the authenticity of the characters you'd created sometimes, and wondered whether or not, when they're read by females, they would be, I don't know, their authenticity would be validated.
Oh, look, you can't judge that. I mean, all you can do is what you know, try and create it the way you see it. And it's somebody else who has to say, you know, you have no idea what it is.
Well, we are now officially out of time, but as
I'm
I said,
out of voice.
and out of voice. But David's got a good, strong signing hand, and he's going to be up the back signing his books for you. So all that remains for us is to wish him a happy 80th birthday and to thank him for being here.
Thank you.